Welcome to Nursing the Nation, the podcast where we dissect today's headlines, current events, and hot topics through the uniquely insightful lens of nursing. I'm Jamie Bourgeois, a certified nurse midwife and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and now officially a nursing PhD candidate.
And I'm Dr. Melissa Ann DuBois, a perinatal nurse turned professor and researcher with a PhD in nursing science. Together, we use our nursing expertise to break through the medical jargon and political noise to explore the human element of current affairs, providing a grounded and compassionate understanding of the issues that impact us all.
Because when it comes to understanding the pulse of our society, who better to ask than the most trusted profession?
Hello, Nursing the Nation listeners. I'm Melissa Ann.
And I'm Jamie. Today we're going to talk about foodborne illness. Does it seem like this whole summer we've been hearing about more cases of illness related to food in the United States? It sure as hell does to me. I mean, how many times have you heard about explosive diarrhea this summer, right? So, it's probably been more times than you want, for sure. But, given the media attention to the cyclospora outbreak this summer, and then now there's more news about salmonella and Campylobacter, E. coli, listeria, you name it, I figured there was no better time for us to investigate whether we really are experiencing worsening foodborne illnesses and outbreaks as compared to previous years.
What we found interesting, although not surprising, is that depending on how you measure foodborne illness, it may or may not be worse. So, how can this be? Before we get into this, let's first discuss how public health officials operate in discovering and tracking outbreaks. We are going to talk about it from the local level and how it escalates to a national concern. Typically, there are two ways in which public health officials learn of potential issues. First is from complaints made by the public, then the other is laboratory driven. Let's trace how a complaint from the public could potentially spark an investigation. For example, let's say that someone calls the local health department after a wedding reception or a restaurant meal. This is the classic point source outbreak, and it typically stays local. The CIFOR, or Council to Improve Foodborne Outbreak Response Guidelines, the operational standard for local, state, tribal, territorial, and federal agencies, treat consumer complaint systems as a core detection channel alongside other public health measures like subcluster investigations, epidemiologic tracebacks, and environmental assessments. The local public health department response is usually a combined effort. Typically, public health nurses or other public health officials interview the sick, construct a case definition, and a chart of the timeline of when people became ill. They will do a retrospective cohort study, which basically just means taking a group of people and looking backwards. And if there's a defined guest list, for example, a wedding reception, they can do that. And they can send an environmental health specialist to the reception hall or facility to look for contributing factors like sick food workers, temperature abuse, cross-contamination, etc. Control measures or ways to contain the illness include closure, exclusion of workers, or discarding the product. And these happen at this level under state and local authority, not federal. So complaint-driven detection is fast, but low resolution. Basically, it will catch local outbreaks fairly easily, but it never catches a contaminated ingredient distributed to 40 states, for example.
Right, yeah. And then there's the lab-driven investigation. And this still starts from like individual people, but it's the lab that basically triggers this investigation. So here's what happens. Let's say you come down with abdominal pain, you've got that explosive diarrhea, right? The nausea, it doesn't it isn't going away after a day or so. So you're figuring this must be something more than just the garden variety GI bug. So you go to your doc for an evaluation, which includes providing a stool sample. And the lab identifies salmonella from that sample. So this kicks off an automatic protocol governed by public health policy. So the lab is legally required to report the finding, and forward the sample to the state public health lab. Then the state lab sequences it. That sequence goes into a system called PulseNet, and this is a national database. And so this was like a little cool tidbit that I learned, which is this PulseNet system is a system much like the national fingerprint database, except PulseNet is a CDC-run database containing the genetic codes of various bacteria. So this is something where you need to keep in mind about PulseNet's role here is because this is the critical link to tracking national outbreaks. So, back to the example here, where you're sick, you go to your doc, you have that lab performed, the lab finds a salmonella, and now the lab is legally required to escalate this to the state, state lab, et cetera, et cetera. So, while you're back at home recovering, trying to keep hydrated, there's a lot of work going on to figure out where did this salmonella come from. So back at that state public health lab, who now is performing that whole genome sequencing, they're trying to figure out they're trying to get that fingerprint of that salmonella, and they upload those results to PulseNet. Now, every state has at least one PulseNet lab with access to the database holding over 1 million bacterial DNA fingerprints. The microbiologists and epidemiologists will then look to see, are there any other active or recent cases of salmonella that have the matching genetic code to your sample elsewhere in the country. Now, they can see that, for instance, there could be 3 cases in 3 different states, and there doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever, but now we can link them and further investigation begins. State and local officials interview, ill people about like what and where they ate in the days or weeks prior to their symptoms or illness began. And remember, this is all occurring in 3 different states simultaneously, who then coordinate their investigation and data. Once a food source is identified as a possible kind of vector, or like think of it as it's the source for the outbreak, the overseeing federal agency begins their investigation. There isn't one specific agency that does this depending on what the food source is. So, for example, if it is suspected meat as the vector of the illness, then the USDA steps in. If it's produce or packaged foods, then the FDA is the federal agency that picks up from here. The CDC is also involved in coordinating these efforts and collecting data. And once the food source is identified, which includes a lot more testing, the agencies attempt to stop the outbreak through recalls and media blitzes.
Right. But here's the crazy part. Food recalls have historically not been mandatory.
Right. That is
Let that
crazy.
sink in. The federal agency involved can ask the company involved to post a recall of the identified food source, but that doesn't mean they have to. In other words, nobody in the government can force that meat, that contaminated E. coli meat, off the shelves.
Right.
If USDA finds E. coli from ground beef from a cattle farm, right, it can't order a recall. It can only ask the company, oh, please, will you do one?
Yes.
Every single USDA food recall is voluntary, done by the company itself. The USDA requires companies to have a recall plan written down in advance, but pulling the trigger is the company's call, not the government's. In 2011, the FDA was given legal authority to order a recall, but only after it first asks the company very nicely and gives them a chance to do it themselves. It doesn't apply to farms either, only registered facilities, and it's treated as a last resort.
Yeah.
So, if a company will not recall the food voluntarily, the agencies can issue a public health alert. So now we're starting to use the
Mhm.
media to put pressure on the
Right.
companies. So, the bottom line here is the entire system runs on companies choosing to cooperate. It works most of the time. But the high risk food category, the highest risk, meat and poultry, is the one where the government has the least formal power. And that gap exists because of how statutes were written a century apart. not because anyone decided it actually made sense.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the things that really kinda caught my attention in looking at, you know, first of all, the food recalls are not mandatory. That just blew my mind. But the fact that what the CDC will do, or the FDA or the USDA will issue that public health alert. And then that triggered how it's communicated in the media. So now think of it this way, like if you hear something on the media saying, there's a public health alert about blah, 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 like whatever it is. I think right now the latest is the alfalfa sprouts, right? So when you hear those words, public health alert, that's not the company
Right.
letting the public know. This is the federal agency involved that had to let the public know. So that should tell you something about, the agency or the food company or whatever that's involved. They're not willing to make that call apparently. So, I thought that was interesting. But anyway, going back to this. So, now that we know how the system works when an outbreak occurs, are we really seeing more of them? That was kind of my question. Are we really seeing more of them this year? Or is this kind of like the media just making it feel this way?
That's the nurse scientist in you, Jamie. Oh,
Well, I'm getting there, right? To That's what we hope my brain will do. And, this really gets back to how we count it. So, if we are talking about how many recalls for food contamination that there have been, like this year compared to previous, then no. There's no evidence that the number of recalls is more than recent years. But if we're going to count the number of people with lab confirmed illness, then hell yes, this has been a
right.
bad year.
Exactly.
Yes. So, how can this be that we have the same number of outbreaks, but so much more illness? This is this is where nobody can agree. Basically, when I was reading about this, there are several claims as to why this is. So, one is that the cyclosporiasis outbreak, explosive diarrhea, which is how I'll always think of it from this point forward. That is a countrywide outbreak. So at least 47 states can link infections directly to the Taylor Farms brand lettuce. This is particularly widespread. So this is like a really big outbreak in and of itself. So it affected a lot of people, and the numbers that they report of confirmed cases is probably a small percentage of what really occurred.
Right.
So another take is that the demand by consumers for ready to eat and prepackaged foods has grown. And these are foods that tend to be more prone to contamination. I didn't really see a heck of a lot of evidence about that because I don't know what prepackaged foods this particular year have had more. I mean, I suppose ready to eat lettuce would be considered prepackaged food, but
Right. I mean, there's 2 parts to that, right? So, it is true that ready-to-eat and prepackaged foods are, over the grand scheme of things, linked to more foodborne illnesses. I mean, I've known that for years. They say,
yeah,
when you have a bag of shredded iceberg, it's
right.
not from one head of iceberg lettuce. It's like millions of heads of iceberg lettuce that have all been like mushed up together, right?
They make it sound so appetizing.
Exactly, as opposed to buying a head of lettuce, you know that that's just
Right.
one head of lettuce, right? So we know that is true. However, are the ready-to-eat and prepackaged foods been eaten more this year than the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? That I just
Yeah.
I'm
Well, and
skeptical.
that's exactly where my skepticism comes in because
Right,
I'm not so sure that like 2026 has grown leaps and bounds for ready
exactly,
to eat
over
and pre.
2025, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, the last argument here is that the response infrastructure to all of this has been weakened. So, for instance, about half of West Virginia's food safety positions are vacant
Ugh,
and they can't find anybody. So the state decided to lower the education requirements back in March of 2026 because they couldn't find anybody. They couldn't fill anybody for these positions. And even with those, um, uh, education standards being lowered, they still haven't filled those particular positions. So, a weakening infrastructure, if you don't have the support in public health and in the food sciences, within all of these structures, then yeah, that's gonna slow the whole thing down.
I'm just going to go on a very short tangent here. I am fundamentally, to the core of my being, against if you can't find the people with the
Yeah,
expertise to fill the position, you should find scholarship ways to put money into scholarships or to recruit
right.
people to get the expertise to fill those positions, not
Yeah,
lower the educational requirements.
yeah, let's
Like
not lower the standards.
that's that's happening in nursing too.
I
I
know.
think don't quote me, I think it was Kansas that is
Yes,
decreasing. You can't find enough
yes,
nurse faculty with,
yep,
master's or doctoral level education. So
yep,
instead of
now it's
providing
bachelor's.
scholarship opportunities or pathways for nurses to get that expertise, they are
Yep.
lowering it to a bachelor's degree needed to teach. It's just unbelievable.
Right, right. Having had the education beyond the bachelor's level, it
Yes,
is
exactly.
mind-blowing. And, we're gonna completely, sidetrack ourselves here, but, like, there are very wonderful bachelor's level educated nurses with many years
100%.
experience
I was
who
one for
could
20 years.
yeah, who could
I'm an expert in
teach.
my field, don't get me wrong, but I
Yeah.
learned a heck of a lot at my doctoral program that I did not know before that.
Well, exactly, and that's the thing is you don't know what you don't know, and,
Exactly.
it and then you're the one teaching?
Exactly.
That's concerning. So, connecting that kind of back to these like lowering educational requirements and standards for these positions, like that's basically the same thing. You've got people who don't understand the full concepts that go into, foodborne safety, public health, epidemiology, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for all the West Virginians
Yeah.
that are,
Yeah.
it's like, come on. But anyway,
Yeah.
moving on.
Good luck
So,
with your explosive diarrheas.
so most state food safety and outbreak programs are funded by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, grants. And the administration reappropriated CDC grants by roughly 40%, about 5.8 billion with a B as of May of last year. Kentucky reports its food safety staff is down 30 to 50%. Ohio says its response is unaffected. Michigan fought its grant cuts in court and won. The 2025 reorganization of HHS, which is Health and Human Services, cut staff across multiple agencies involved in food safety. Also, the FDA Food Safety Center previously tracked 8 pathogens, but dropped 6 of them from their surveillance programs. Shockingly, cyclospora was one of them.
Yeah, yeah, isn't that funny? The exact year they stop, like,
Mhm.
proactively looking for it, look what
Yep.
happens. Mhm.
The FDA also disbanded its National Advisory Committee on Microbiological Criteria in Food. A spokesperson for the FDA said investigators were not affected by these force reductions. And HHS says FDA investigators weren't affected by workforce restructuring. But I just want anybody who's ever worked in any company at all to just
Right,
take that in, right?
yeah,
Have you ever not been affected by workforce reductions? Like, give me a break.
right,
So, this boils down to two basic claims. It is where more contamination is happening versus whether detection and response are slower. Okay. The first isn't clearly supported by 2026 recall data. The director of the Institute for Food Safety and Nutrition Security at George Washington University has pointed out that CDC's remaining passive surveillance depends on states reporting with no required timeline, and FDA meets only a fraction of the inspections Congress mandates.
yeah, and that's under best of circumstances where, this director was quoting. So even
Right.
with, the workforce being where it was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. It still wasn't being able to meet the demand and the need. So, you know, I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody who's been a listener, uh, all along, knows that I'm inclined to obviously say the Trump administration is involved here as to why we're having all of these problems. But, frankly, in all fairness, there's been issues with the US food safety inspection systems all along. So, if you have ever read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which if you haven't, I highly suggest, then I am pretty sure you know exactly what I mean, right? Like, I came across I wish I'm gonna butcher the meme itself, but, actually just today I came across something that, kinda spoke to what happens when we don't have the infrastructure and the food safety rules and regulations, and without trying to remember the meme itself, I'm just gonna leave it there. But but needless to say, it made a very good point. I think it was talking about actually, now that I'm thinking of it more, it said something about how, like, the reason that, like, we have safe, milk, for instance, is because of things that companies will do when left to their own capitalist devices, right? Anyway, again, I gotta move on from that because 'cause I'll keep going back to that. Anyway, food safety inspections of manufacturers by the FDA plummeted, from 10,641 facilities in 2011 to about 4,500 a decade later. The FDA's investigator core was already about 10% below its own authorized level in mid-2024, with a quarter of its retirement eligible, workforce, and, you know, it takes 2 years apparently to properly train, this foodborne, what did they call it? The food investigator corps. 2 years of training to properly train them. And within, a year, that vacancy rate has doubled. So, that this is also before the Trump administration comes in and cuts 3,500 jobs at the FDA in an effort to reduce federal spending.
Which didn't work.
Yeah, really, it's not working. But, Bobby, our friend Bobby, he says the food surveillance system is, quote, working better than it's ever worked in history.
They can say that, but
Sure, they can. Well, they do, don't they? Um,
Mhm.
KFF and CIDRAP, they are a public health kind of journalistic group at the University of Minnesota. They reported back in August of 2025, both of them, that the regulatory rollbacks and the federal layoffs were going to threaten food safety. Okay, so they were saying this a year ago. So I guess really no one can really say they didn't see this coming. Um, I would certainly say the nurses who do illness investigations in local public health departments certainly could say they saw this coming too.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, nurses understand the harmful effects of things like severe dehydration, kidney failure, and other life-threatening complications that happen when safety systems fail. And I want to be direct with the listeners. While there are some best practices you can take at home to decrease your risk of illness, you cannot wash or cook your way out of a contaminated food supply. So,
Right.
as we discussed, before a single ingredient reaches your kitchen, there is a massive invisible shield protecting you. And as public health officials say, the worst, the worst thing that happens to public health is that it works, right? Because when
Right.
something works, people think you don't need it anymore because there's no illnesses. But the reason why
Yes.
there's no illnesses is because it's working behind the scenes, you know?
Right, right. You're not seeing all the things that are making that happen. Yeah.
Exactly. So, federal and local public health programs are inspectors, laboratory epidemiologists, and outbreak trackers at the FDA, USDA, CDC, and your state and local public health departments.
Mhm.
They inspect processing plants, test water supplies, and pull contaminated products off store shelves before they land at your dinner table. Uh, Side story: my sister in law and brother-in-law own a farm brewery and creamery on a working dairy farm in Massachusetts.
Oh,
And
cool.
they just started making their own cheese for with their own milk. This has been a dream of my sister-in-law for a long time. So the creamery, the building that the creamery's in, is like Fort Knox.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there's all of these, legal regulations. You
Mm,
have to, like, dress in certain clothes, then you have to, like, step in this bleach solution, and, like, the entire facility, like, is Fort Knox. Like, nobody can go in except the people that have been, like, extensively trained,
yeah.
decontamination areas, um,
Mm,
and once you kinda get into that room, it's so time consuming to, like, get prepped to get in to make the cheese. It's like a 15-hour day. Like, you have to stay there and finish it all, right? Somebody comes every 3 weeks to swab the surfaces, the floor, the equipment for bacteria. It's like a huge operation, and it's regulated by the government to keep us safe, right?
mhm.
So that's just like a small example that I know in
Yeah.
my own personal life. So, you know, when public health budgets and regulatory programs are cut, this not imaginary, invisible shield, it's very much not imaginary.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
invisible shield disappears. Outbreak detection slows down. Recalls happen days or weeks too late. Pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, they go unnoticed in supply chains. And the result isn't just a stomach ache, it's
Right.
crowded emergency rooms, permanent organ damage, miscarriages, avoidable deaths, especially among children, the elderly, and the pregnant people, right?
Yeah.
So, strong government oversight isn't red tape, it's a life saving preventative medicine. When we defund public health, we trade our safety for medical crisis. Like, that's
Yeah.
like just like bottom line, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And we, trade it for medical crises in a system that is also clawing back all sorts of funding and support for people who need it.
100%.
Yeah. So that's a recipe for disaster. And on that happy note, that's a nurse's take on the rise of foodborne illness in the US. We hope that you found this episode informative and thought provoking, and we would be honored if you would share it with your family and friends. Don't forget to subscribe to Nursing the Nation wherever you get your podcasts. Write us a 5-star review and subscribe to our Substack, which will also have all sorts of information and resources for this episode. And that's at nursingthenation.substack.com. This will clearly also keep you in the loop of various episodes and issues going on. So thank you for tuning in to Nursing the Nation. I'm Jamie Bourgeois.
And I'm Melissa Ann DuBois. You can sponsor our work by heading over to Substack for more information. And that being said, until next time.
Yes. Thanks for joining us on Nursing the Nation, where we discuss the headlines and current events through a nursing perspective. Remember to follow us on your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, and share this episode with someone who needs a nurse's take on the nation. Nursing the Nation is hosted by Jamie Bourgeois and Melissa Ann DuBois. Topic research is done by Jamie and Melissa. Editing is done by Jamie. Music is by Magnus Moon. Head over to our Substack at Nursing the Nation for detailed show notes. We speak from the experiences and expertise of being nurses, but the opinions on this podcast are our own and not representative of any employer, institution, or organization we may be affiliated with. Thanks for listening, and please follow our socials.